Homeless veteran asked, "Play for food?" Crowd laughed, then learned. He's a piano legend. On a cold evening, under the fading glow of city lights, a weary homeless veteran sat quietly at the corner of a crowded street. His clothes were torn and layered with dust, his hands rough and scarred from both labor and battles long past, and his eyes carried the heavy weight of hunger. Beside him rested a small cardboard sign, the words written in shaky strokes, "Can I play for food?" Most people passed by without sparing him a glance, and those who did either smirked or shook their heads in disbelief. Some even laughed at the thought of a homeless man playing music, dismissing him as a trickster trying to win sympathy. They could not have imagined that behind the frail figure sat a story of brilliance, sacrifice, and talent that had once filled great halls. With music, the crowd had already judged him, but destiny had other plans for this night. After what felt like endless hours, a kind stranger rolled a small upright piano closer to him, intrigued by the sign and curious to see what the man could do. By now, a few passers-by had gathered, watching with folded arms and mocking grins. They expected nothing more than random, broken notes from a man who looked like he had long forgotten what music even was. The veteran looked down at the keys, his hands trembling from both weakness and anticipation. Slowly, he placed his fingers on the piano, and for a moment, silence wrapped the street. Then, with a sudden burst of grace, the first chords poured out, not clumsy or dull, but powerful, precise, and soulful. It was as if time froze. The sound rose with elegance, each note carrying a depth that spoke of pain, loss, love, and triumph. People who had been laughing seconds ago now stood wide-eyed, unable to believe what they were hearing. The music told a story no words could capture. Each keystroke carried fragments of his past, moments of joy before war, heartbreak after battles, and the silent strength it took to survive on the streets. Pedestrians stopped mid-step, shopkeepers leaned outside their doors, and children tugged at their parents' hands to stay and listen. Phones came out to record, but most people simply stood in awe, their expressions softening with every passing second. Even the ones who had mocked him earlier now looked down in shame, realizing they had misjudged a man who carried a gift far greater than anything they had seen in their daily routines. The piano's voice echoed through the street like a reminder that talent, dignity, and greatness often hide beneath appearances that society overlooks. When the last note finally lingered in the air, a wave of silence held everyone captive for a heartbeat before thunderous applause erupted. People rushed forward, placing food, money, and warm clothes beside him, some even offering him shelter or a chance to perform again. The veteran simply bowed his head with a quiet smile, as though the music had already said everything he wished to express. That night, he was no longer seen as a forgotten man on the street. He was revealed as a piano legend, a man whose music had once filled concert halls, now reclaiming his voice before strangers who would never forget what they had witnessed. On a restless evening, under the glow of streetlights, a weary homeless veteran sat alone at the corner of a busy street. His clothes were tattered, his hands bore the scars of hardship and battles long past, and his eyes reflected both hunger and exhaustion. Beside him rested a cardboard sign with shaky letters that read, "Can I play for food?" Most people who walked by barely looked at him, dismissing him as just another forgotten soul on the sidewalk. Some smirked, some whispered mockery, and a few even laughed, believing the idea of a homeless man playing music was nothing more than a sad attempt to win sympathy. Yet hidden behind that fragile figure was a talent that once filled concert halls with elegance and mastery, a secret no one in the crowd could have imagined. After sitting unnoticed for hours, a kind stranger paused and, moved by curiosity, rolled over a small piano toward the man. The onlookers gathered closer, smirking and shaking their heads, convinced they were about to witness clumsy notes from a broken man who had long forgotten the sound of real music. The veteran sat still for a moment, his frail hands trembling, as they hovered over the keys. Then, with the faintest breath, he pressed down. For an instant there was only silence, but then came a burst of sound so pure and powerful it silenced the entire street. The first notes struck with elegance and precision, not the fumbling of a beginner, but the skill of a true master. The melody leapt into the air, weaving stories of pain, love, and resilience, carrying an emotional weight that no one had expected. The laughter that had filled the street moments earlier melted into stunned silence. Every chord told a story, not just of music, but of a man's journey through sacrifice, heartbreak, and survival. His fingers glided across the keys, releasing, a symphony that seemed to rise from the depths of his soul. Pedestrians froze mid-step. Shopkeepers leaned out of their doorways, and children sat down on the pavement, captivated by the brilliance before them. Some raised their phones to capture the moment, but most were too moved to do anything but listen. Tears welled up in the eyes of strangers who moments before had ignored him, realizing they were witnessing greatness hidden beneath worn clothes and weary eyes. The music spoke directly to their hearts, reminding them that worth cannot be measured by appearances, and that true beauty often hides in the most overlooked places. When the final note drifted into the night air, there was a heartbeat of silence, before the street erupted in thunderous applause. People rushed forward, leaving food, money, and warm clothing at his side, some even offering him shelter or opportunities to perform again. The veteran simply bowed his head with a humble smile, letting the music remain his only voice. That night, he was no longer just a hungry man begging for food. He was revealed as a piano legend, reclaiming his identity in front of strangers who would never forget the sound they had heard. On a cold evening, as the city hurried past, a homeless veteran sat quietly on the corner with a worn cardboard sign that read, "Can I play for food?" His clothes were ragged, his shoes torn, and his tired eyes revealed both hunger and years of hardship. People glanced at him briefly, then walked away, some even laughing at the thought of a man in such a state claiming he could play music. Many assumed it was just another trick to get sympathy. For hours he remained invisible, shivering as strangers ignored his plea. Yet beneath the rough exterior and weary silence lay a secret. He was not just another forgotten man on the street. He carried within him a gift that had once mesmerized audiences in grand concert halls, a gift the world had long overlooked but was about to rediscover. Finally, one kind passerby noticed the sign and rolled out a small piano from a nearby shop, encouraging the veteran to play. A small crowd gathered, smirking and whispering as they expected nothing more than broken notes from trembling fingers. The man sat still, his frail hands hovering over the keys, trembling not just from hunger, but from anticipation. Then, as he pressed the first chord, everything changed. The sound that burst forth was rich, clear, and filled with emotion. The melody that followed carried both sorrow and beauty, weaving through the air like a story that words could never capture. It was not the clumsy attempt of a beggar, but the flawless touch of a master musician. The same crowd that had laughed now fell silent, their faces frozen in disbelief. Every note seemed to speak a language of its own. The music told of sacrifice, of battles fought and losses endured, of fleeting joys and the quiet strength of survival. The veteran's fingers moved gracefully, filling the air with a symphony that wrapped around the listeners and held them captive. Pedestrians stopped in their tracks. Shopkeepers leaned out of their doors, and children sat down on the pavement, completely entranced. Phones were lifted to record the moment, but most people stood still, too moved to do anything but listen. Tears welled up in the eyes of strangers who had mocked him minutes earlier, their hearts touched by a performance that seemed to come from a place deeper than suffering itself. The man who had been invisible only moments ago was now commanding the attention of the entire street. When the final note hung in the air and slowly faded, there was a moment of profound silence before applause erupted. People rushed forward, placing food, money, and warm clothing at his feet, offering help, and even speaking of opportunities to bring him back onto a real stage. Yet the veteran only smiled humbly, his eyes shining with quiet gratitude. That night he was no longer seen as a beggar or a forgotten soldier. He was revealed as a piano legend who had reclaimed his voice in front of strangers who would never forget the sound that transformed their laughter into awe. On a chilly night, beneath the buzzing glow of streetlights, a weary homeless veteran sat quietly on the corner of a busy street. His clothes were worn thin, his shoes broken, and his face carried the deep lines of hardship and years of survival. In front of him was a small piece of cardboard with shaky handwriting that read, "Can I play for food?" The words were simple, but most who passed by did not care enough to read them closely. Some smirked, others whispered cruel jokes, and a few laughed openly, shaking their heads at the thought of a hungry, ragged man daring to call himself a musician. To them, he was nothing more than another forgotten soul, a man lost to the world. What they could not see was that behind the tired eyes and trembling hands lived a gift that had once commanded silence in grand halls, a gift hidden for far too long. As the night stretched on, a kind stranger noticed the sign and, with curiosity, placed a small piano before him. The crowd that had gathered leaned closer, expecting nothing but a clumsy attempt, ready to laugh once more. The veteran's hands shook as they hovered above the keys, not only from hunger but from the weight of the moment. Then he pressed down, and the first note rang out clear and pure, silencing the entire street. What followed was not a hesitant tune, but a river of sound that flowed with power, beauty, and emotion. Each chord told a story that words could never capture, carrying the weight of sacrifice, the ache of loss, and the resilience of survival. The man who had been mocked moments earlier transformed into a master before their eyes. The music was not only played, it was lived. The melody rose and fell like waves, and with each note the crowd's expressions shifted. Pedestrians stopped, walking, their curiosity holding them still. Shopkeepers leaned out of their doors, their faces softening as they listened. Children sat cross-legged on the pavement, their eyes wide with awe. Even those who had mocked him earlier lowered their heads, ashamed of their laughter. Phones appeared in the crowd to record the performance, but many could not bring themselves to look away long enough to capture it, fearing they might miss even a moment. The music spoke to something deeper than entertainment. It reminded them of the humanity and greatness hidden within those they often chose not to see. When the last note lingered and faded into the cold night air, the silence that followed was heavy with reverence. Then, as though released from a spell, the crowd erupted into thunderous applause. People hurried forward, not only with food, but with money, clothing, and offers of shelter. Some whispered about giving him a stage again, about helping him find his way back into the world he once belonged to. The veteran smiled humbly, his eyes shining not with pride, but with gratitude, as if the music had spoken everything he had long kept inside. That night, he was no longer just a man asking for food. He was revealed as a piano legend, reminding the world never to judge greatness by appearances, for brilliance often hides in places where no one dares to look.